Hey guys, tonight, we're easing into a journey back to a time when a sliver of bone or a scrap of fabric could hold more power and value than a king's ransom. We are talking about the Middle Ages, a world steeped in faith, fear, and a surprisingly booming market for the sacred. And specifically, we're going to peek into the shadows of that market, where some folks got a little creative with their inventory. Trust me, being a real medieval relic peddler was nothing like the movies, and definitely not as safe. You probably wouldn't survive this gig without some serious divine intervention, or at least a really good escape plan. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps more than you know, and it's the gentlest way to support these strange historical dives. Also, if you're settling in for this journey, you feel the rough wool of your tunic against your skin, the damp chill seeping up from the cobbled path beneath your worn leather shoes. The air hangs thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely like rancid butter mingling with the sweeter, cloying scent of incense drifting from a nearby church. Your ears pick up the cacophony of the medieval town, the distant peal of bells marking the hours, the rhythmic hammering of a blacksmith, the bleating of sheep being driven through the narrow street, and the low murmur of 100 different conversations in dialects you barely understand. Sunlight, when it manages to pierce the smog and the tight press of buildings, illuminates dust motes dancing in the perpetual gloom of the alleys. This is your world. It is gritty, immediate, and overwhelmingly present. Every surface feels textured rough stone, splintered wood, damp earth, the slick muck underfoot after a rain. You are surrounded by people whose lives are dictated by the rhythms of the seasons, the demands of the harvest, and the unwavering, omnipresent authority of the church. Faith isn't a Sunday affair. It's the very fabric of existence, woven into prayers murmured over meager meals, pleas whispered in times of sickness, and hopes clung to in the face of constant uncertainty. In this world, where life is often short and brutal, the divine feels incredibly close, or at least accessible through the right channels. And perhaps the most powerful, most sought-after channels were the relics. These weren't just historical curiosities, they were physical fragments imbued with astonishing spiritual potency. A bone from a saint, a piece of cloth touched by Christ, a thorn from the crown of thorns, these items were believed to work miracles. They could heal the sick, protect travelers from harm, offer solace to the dying, and even influence battles. Churches, monasteries, and wealthy individuals alike competed fiercely to acquire them. Owning a significant relic could transform a struggling chapel into a major pilgrimage site, drawing in crowds, offerings, and immense prestige. Imagine the cathedral in your town suddenly possessing a genuine piece of the true cross. You'd see pilgrims from miles around, coin flowing into the town, your own status elevated just by living nearby. Relics were, in essence, spiritual assets of incalculable value, combining the sanctity of the divine with the very tangible benefits of tourism and political legitimacy. A fragment of saintly finger bone wasn't just holy. It was a powerful statement of your church's importance, a magnet for wealth and influence, a direct line to the miraculous in a world desperately needing it. This intense demand, this absolute, unquestioning belief in the power held within these sacred objects, created a fascinating and dangerous economic environment. While some relics had well-documented, though often embellished histories, others appeared through less clear means. With so much at stake, so much to gain spiritually and financially, the temptation to perhaps, shall we say, facilitate the acquisition of new relics became irresistible to some. After all, if a bone from St. Peter could cure the plague, couldn't any old bone, presented with enough conviction and displayed in a suitably ornate reliquary, inspire the same hope? What was the difference, really, between a genuine miracle and the fervent belief that one was possible? And thus, the stage was set for those willing to blur the lines between the sacred and the fraudulent. It was a high-stakes game, trading on faith, desperate hope, and the deep human desire for connection to the divine. But as you might imagine, in an era where religious belief held the weight of law and the power of life and death, deceiving the faithful about something so profoundly important was not merely a civil offense. It was a sin, a sacrilege, and a crime that could incur the wrath of both God and man. And that wrath, you quickly learned, could be terrifyingly inventive. Imagine yourself standing in that bustling square, surrounded by the devout and the desperate, feeling the weight of their belief in every stone and every whispered prayer. Can you almost hear the distant chanting from the cathedral, promising solace, or profit? You knew that playing fast and loose with such powerful forces, both spiritual and temporal, carried a risk far greater than mere financial ruin. You find yourself navigating these crowded streets, perhaps with a small bundle tucked close to your chest, a bundle containing not food or coin, but something far more precious, or at least, something you intend to make precious. You've seen how the wealthy abbot's eyes gleam when he speaks of acquiring a new arm bone from St. Bartholomew, how the townsfolk flock to touch the hem of a garment supposedly worn by St. Anne. You've witnessed the sheer, potent power of belief transforming simple objects into miracles. And if belief is the engine, you figure, maybe you can provide a little fuel. How do you even begin to procure such sacred items when most are locked away in heavily guarded reliquaries? Well, necessity and a little bit of questionable piety are the mothers of invention. You might start by befriending a gravedigger. Those fellows see a lot of bones that aren't attached to anyone demanding inconvenient questions. A carefully chosen femur from the local cemetery, perhaps one that looks suitably aged and impressive, can be cleaned, maybe even given a little patina of dirt or smoke to suggest great age. Or perhaps you've heard of a monastery with a less than vigilant night watchman, and you manage to pilfer a small, unremarkable wooden chalice or a length of old linen. It doesn't look special, not yet. The real magic, you see, isn't just in acquiring the object, it's in crafting its story. This scrap of linen, yes, it was supposedly used to wrap the wound of St. Agatha, this bone. Clearly, it's from one of the innocents massacred by Herod. You might even try to create a rudimentary provenance, a shaky-looking document on aged parchment, filled with florid script and official sounding, if entirely fabricated seals, tracing the relic's journey through pious hands over centuries. It's the medieval equivalent of creating a fake eBay listing with glowing reviews and a photoshopped certificate of authenticity. Sometimes, the relic isn't even faked from scratch, but rather an enhancement. You might take a piece of fabric that did touch a genuine relic and then cut it into a dozen smaller pieces, each sold as a direct, powerful contact relic. It's scaling up the divine, you could say, a form of early spiritual fractional ownership. Your customers aren't just random passers-by. They are often wealthy merchants looking to improve their standing, lesser churches eager to draw pilgrims away from more famous shrines, or even powerful nobles seeking spiritual protection for their lands or their souls. They want to believe, and that desire is the most valuable currency you possess. You learn to speak with a certain reverence, a hushed tone when displaying your wares, letting the flickering candlelight in a back room or the solemn atmosphere of a market stall near the church do half the work for you. This wasn't just petty theft. This was a direct challenge to the authority and integrity of the most powerful institution in Europe, the Church. And it wasn't just spiritual fraud, it was recognized as a form of deception under secular law too. To traffic in fake holy items was to defraud not only the buyer of their coin, but also of their faith, their hope for divine intervention. It was sacrilege, undermining the very foundation of popular piety. The Church, ever watchful of its authority and income streams, pilgrimage was big business, took a very dim view of anyone horning in on their sacred monopoly with cheap imitations. They had their own methods of authentication, often involving examining the provenance documents, if they existed, checking if the claimed miracle aligned with saintly history, or sometimes simply relying on the say-so of important churchmen. There wasn't a forensic lab with carbon dating, of course, but there was a network of bishops, abbots, and scholars who kept track of major relics and could spot a poorly constructed story or a bone that looked suspiciously like it came from Geoffrey the Miller's dinner last week. Even within the medieval mindset, while belief was paramount, it wasn't entirely without question. There were figures like the English theologian John Wycliffe, who openly questioned the veneration of relics, or satirists who mocked the proliferation of obviously fake ones. You could apparently assemble a dozen complete bodies of the same popular saint from all the claimed relics floating around Europe. This undercurrent of skepticism, however minor, meant that selling fakes wasn't a guaranteed easy path. You always ran the risk that your latest splinter from the true cross, which you might have whittled from an old fence post, would be examined by someone who knew a bit too much, or worse, someone who had a competing, allegedly real, splinter they needed to protect the value of. You were operating in a space where the product was intangible faith, the market was desperate hope, and the regulators were literally agents of God on earth, armed with considerable temporal power. It was a precarious balance, built on a foundation of lies, constantly teetering on the edge of exposure. And the fall, if it came, promised to be anything but gentle. You learn to pick your moments, and perhaps more importantly, you learn to pick your targets. Selling in a major city with a famous cathedral and well-established, heavily guarded relics is far too risky. They have procedures, eyes everywhere, and a vested interest in shutting down competition, especially fake competition. No, the real opportunity lies in the smaller towns, the rural churches, or with individuals whose piety outstrips their critical thinking or their access to more reputable sources. You might approach a local priest in a quiet village, one whose church is struggling to attract a congregation, whispering about a humble yet powerful relic that found its way into your hands, perhaps a fragment of bone from a lesser-known saint, one whose story is just obscure enough to be difficult to disprove on the spot. You handle the object with exaggerated reverence, your voice dropping to a solemn, almost sacred tone as you recount its entirely fabricated history. You might describe how it was miraculously preserved, how it glowed faintly in the dark, how touching it brought peace to a troubled soul you once knew, another lie, of course. The sale is a performance, a delicate dance between your carefully constructed narrative and the buyer's eager willingness to believe. You show them the object, perhaps a rough, unidentifiable chip of stone you claimed was from the very rock Peter struck to bring forth water, or a length of coarse hair you swore belonged to Mary Magdalene. You watch their eyes, seeing the flicker of hope, the desire for connection to something holy, something powerful that could intercede in their difficult lives. You emphasize the potential benefits, attracting pilgrims, bringing divine favor upon their community, offering personal solace or healing. The price is negotiated in hushed tones, a sum that feels substantial enough to convey value, but not so exorbitant as to immediately arouse suspicion. You might accept coin or perhaps goods, maybe even a promise of shelter or food for your journey. The exchange is quick, done with a sense of clandestine importance, sealing the deal before doubt can truly set in. You leave them holding their precious new acquisition, the weight of it hopefully matched by the weight of their belief. But the moment you walk away, the risk intensifies. Did they truly believe you? Will they have it examined by someone more knowledgeable? Will someone remember seeing that holy artifact looking suspiciously like a common pebble down by the river? The danger wasn't just abstract, it was immediate and personal. An angry, defrauded buyer might track you down, perhaps with friends wielding clubs, demanding their money back or worse. Competing relic sellers, the ones dealing in genuinely sourced, or at least more convincingly sourced items, viewed you as a threat to their livelihood and reputation and wouldn't hesitate to expose you if they had the chance. Local church officials, protective of their parish's spiritual and economic standing, were constantly on guard against fraudsters. Getting caught by any of these could lead to a swift, brutal, and informal justice. A public beating, being thrown in the local stocks for ridicule and rotten fruit, or simply being chased out of town with threats and stones. You learn to travel light, keep a low profile, and always have an escape route planned from any transaction. If you were unlucky enough to be apprehended by the secular authorities, the town guard, the Lord's bailiff, or simply a group of citizens empowered to maintain order, the charges would likely be fraud or theft. Medieval secular law wasn't always uniform across regions, but deception, especially deception involving valuable goods and relics, even fake ones, were treated as valuable, was taken seriously. Punishments were often public and designed to be deterrents. You might find yourself in the pillory, your head and hands locked in a wooden frame in the market square, exposed to the jeers and refuse of the crowd. The sheer humiliation was a powerful punishment in a society where reputation meant everything. Or you might face a public flogging, the bite of the whip, a stark, physical reminder of your transgression. Banishment from the town or region was another common fate, leaving you a rootless wanderer, marked as untrustworthy. These punishments were harsh, painful, and socially ruinous. You would bear the scars, both visible and invisible, for a long time. But as bad as the secular arm could be, it was merely a preview of the truly terrifying consequences that awaited you if the other authority, the one you had truly offended, decided to take an interest. But then you made a mistake. Perhaps you grew overconfident, attempting a sale in a town too close to a major cathedral. Or maybe you were betrayed by an accomplice, or even a disgruntled buyer who finally saw your holy bone for the chicken bone it was. This time, it wasn't the secular authorities who came for you. This time, it was the church. And you quickly understood that offending the town guard was like upsetting a grumpy badger compared to awakening the ire of an institution that believed it held the keys to heaven and hell. The church in the Middle Ages wasn't just a religious body. It was a state within a state, with its own laws, its own courts, and the power to enforce its judgments with a weight that extended far beyond your earthly life. To defraud the church, to sell fake holy items, wasn't just theft or deception in their eyes. It was sacrilege, a direct insult to God and the saints, and potentially even heresy by leading the faithful astray. And heresy was considered the ultimate crime, a spiritual plague threatening the very soul of Christendom. Your apprehension by church officials was different. There was a chilling solemnity to it. No rough handling, perhaps, but a quiet, implacable authority that felt far more terrifying than a brandished club. You might be taken to a monastery, a bishop's palace, or a dedicated building used for ecclesiastical inquiries. The air in these places is cold, the stone walls feel thick and oppressive, and the silence is broken only by the distant sound of chanting or the echoing footsteps of robed figures. You are brought before men with grave faces, their eyes sharp and assessing. These aren't judges looking at evidence of a material crime. They are inquisitors, in the broader sense, not necessarily the later formal institution, but the function existed, looking into the state of your soul and the depth of your sin. The questioning isn't about whether you took the money. It's about whether you have repented of your wicked deeds, whether you truly believe in the sanctity you have mocked, whether you have led others into sin through your deception. The interrogation process could be psychologically grueling. Confined to a small, bare cell, given meager food, left in isolation, all designed to soften you up, to make you contemplate the eternal damnation you were supposedly risking. They might question you relentlessly, citing scripture, invoking the wrath of God, and urging you to confess not just your actions, but the sinful intent behind them. They might use sleep deprivation or prolonged standing to wear you down. While the more infamous torture methods are often associated with later periods, medieval church courts did employ physical coercion to assist hesitant confessors. This could range from binding your limbs tightly to more severe methods, all justified under the chilling logic that temporary pain was a small price to pay to save your immortal soul from the eternal fires of hell. You are constantly reminded that your fate, both earthly and divine, rests on your confession and genuine repentance. The pressure is immense, a heavy cloak of spiritual dread added to your physical discomfort. You might find yourself wanting to confess to anything just to make it stop, to earn a shred of mercy, to lift the terrible weight of their judgment. Even a confession, however, didn't necessarily free you from punishment. It merely opened the door to a different kind of fate. Forgiveness from the church often came with a hefty price. You might be forced to undergo public penance, standing outside the church door during services, wearing a sign proclaiming your crime. Or you could be ordered to undertake a perilous, soul-cleansing pilgrimage, perhaps walking hundreds of miles to a distant shrine, alone and often relying on charity, a constant reminder of your sin with every weary step. Sometimes the punishment involved wearing distinctive symbols sewn onto your clothes, perhaps small crosses or images of the relics you mocked, marking you publicly as a deceiver, a constant source of shame and a warning to others. These punishments served multiple purposes. They punished the offender, shamed them publicly, provided a visible deterrent, and reinforced the church's authority and the sanctity of genuine relics. You would walk among others, forever identifiable by these marks, whispers following you, doors closing as you approached. This public humiliation, this social ostracization, could be a living hell in itself. But even this was not the worst the church could inflict. If you were deemed unrepentant, if your fraud was widespread and caused significant scandal, or if you were suspected of deeper heretical leanings beyond just selling fakes, then the consequences moved from the harsh to the truly horrific. The pressure intensifies, not just on your body, but on your very soul. You feel the weight of centuries of doctrine, the absolute conviction of the robed figures across from you that they are doing God's work by unearthing your deceit. They speak of eternal torment, of the fires of hell, painting vivid pictures that, in this deeply faithful age, feel terrifyingly real. If you remain stubborn, if you refuse to name accomplices, even ones you didn't have, if you fail to perform your penance with sufficient, visible humility, or worst of all, if they suspect your false relics were born not merely of greed, but of a deliberate, mocking disbelief in the sacred, a hint of heresy, then their demeanor shifts. The paternalistic tone of saving your soul is replaced by something colder, harder. You are no longer a sinner to be guided back to the fold, but a blight to be excised, for lesser offenses, or if you were deemed genuinely repentant and lucky, the public penance or pilgrimage might suffice. But for the more grievous cases or repeat offenders, the punishments escalated dramatically. The church could issue a sentence of excommunication. Imagine being cut off from everything that gave your life meaning and structure in this era. No longer welcome in the church, barred from receiving the sacraments, the very keys to salvation according to belief. Your neighbors would shun you, fearing divine retribution by association. No one would trade with you, offer you shelter, or even speak to you if they could avoid it. You couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Your soul was essentially marked for damnation, cut adrift from the community of the faithful. It was a form of social and spiritual death, a terrifying isolation that could break a person entirely, leaving them a pariah wandering the fringes of society, their eternal fate sealed in the eyes of everyone they met sometimes. The punishment was etched onto your very flesh. While not universally applied solely for relic fraud, punishments involving mutilation were common in medieval law, and the Church could recommend or instigate them, particularly if the fraud was seen as a perversion of sacred acts. A forger who signed false documents might lose the fingers used for writing. A thief might lose a hand. For someone who used their words and hands to deceive the faithful with false relics, the punishment might involve branding, a hot iron pressing a mark onto your skin, a permanent scar proclaiming your crime for all to see. Or perhaps the cropping of an ear, leaving you visibly, permanently marked as a deceiver. These weren't just physical punishments, they were symbolic acts, destroying the tool of the crime or branding the criminal as untrustworthy forever. And then comes the moment you realize the true, terrifying extent of the authority you mocked. You realize this isn't about the coin you took, it's about the faith you stole. And for that, the price is measured not in silver, but in flesh, or eternity. If the church officials decide you are utterly without genuine repentance, if your crime is too scandalous, too damaging to their authority, or if they genuinely believe you are a heretic disguised as a fraudster, they perform a chilling ritual. The act of relinquishing you to the secular arm. The church, in its official capacity, shed no blood, but by handing you over to the civil authorities, the local lord, the king's justice, they knew precisely what fate awaited you. It was a death sentence delivered with clean hands. The spiritual judgment passed to the earthly powers for final, brutal execution being handed over to the secular authorities, often meant facing the ultimate punishment for crimes linked to sacrilege or heresy. Execution by burning at the stake. Fire was seen as a purifying force, capable of consuming the spiritual corruption of heresy and preventing it from spreading. The execution was a public spectacle, a grim piece of theater played out in the town square or just outside the city walls. You would be led through the streets, perhaps dressed in a humiliating garment, accompanied by guards and priests, the crowd gathering, some jeering, some silently terrified. Tied to a stake, surrounded by faggots of wood, you would face the final moments. The smoke, the heat, the pain, it was designed to be a horrifying deterrent, a stark warning to anyone who dared to tamper with the sacred or defy the church. Other forms of execution like hanging or beheading were also possible depending on the specific legal customs of the region and the exact charges. But the burning stake was the fate most often associated with those deemed a threat to spiritual purity and authority. There was no Christian burial for such individuals. Their bodies, like their souls, were considered condemned, unfit to rest in consecrated ground, a final, chilling end to a life built on holy lies. And as the smoke rises and the crowd begins to disperse, shuffling back to their daily routines as if witnessing a soul condemned to eternal fire is just another Tuesday spectacle, you breathe in slowly. The imagined smell of burning wood and something far more unpleasant fades, replaced by the comforting, ordinary air of your own space. But the chill lingers, the understanding settling deep within you. This wasn't just about one person caught in a lie. It was about the intricate, often brutal machinery of medieval society, a world where the lines between spiritual devotion, earthly power, and economic survival were hopelessly, fascinatingly blurred. Your fate, if caught, wasn't decided by a single authority, but by a complex interplay of forces you navigated every day, perhaps without fully grasping their reach. Imagine the legal landscape for a moment. You weren't just subject to a single set of laws. You lived under a dual system, two immense powers holding sway over different aspects of your life. There was the secular law, enforced by kings, lords, and town councils, dealing with crimes against property, violence, and breaches of the peace. If you stole a loaf of bread, cheated a merchant in a deal unrelated to the sacred, or got into a brawl, the secular court was where you'd end up. But then there was the church's law, the canon law, which governed everything from marriage and oaths to heresy, and crucially, offenses against the divine and the church itself. Selling fake relics fell squarely into this overlapping, dangerous territory. The church could claim jurisdiction because it involved sacred objects and defrauding the faithful. The secular authorities could claim it because it involved theft and fraud, taking people's tangible money. Often, the church's authority took precedence, especially in matters touching on faith or sacrilege, and they could decide if your crime warranted being handed over to the secular arm for a punishment they deemed appropriate, even if the secular court alone might have given a lesser sentence. This dual system meant there was no single safe harbor, no simple set of rules. You were accountable to two demanding masters, both quick to punish perceived threats to their authority or their flock. Think about where you stood in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. Were you a landless peasant, a traveling peddler with no fixed abode, a struggling craftsman in a town, or perhaps someone with slightly more status, like a minor clerk or a village priest looking to boost his church's income? Your place on the social ladder significantly impacted your vulnerability. If you were poor and transient, you were easy to blame, easy to make an example of. You lacked powerful connections who could intercede on your behalf or vouch for your character. Your disappearance or harsh punishment wouldn't disrupt the established order. On the other hand, if you were a respected guildsman or a member of the minor clergy, your actions would cause a greater scandal, drawing more unwelcome attention from higher authorities, bishops, abbots, powerful nobles who funded churches. It was a strange paradox. Having higher status might offer a shield, but it also raised the stakes dramatically if you were caught in such a deeply impious deception. The most successful and longest-lasting relic frauds were often orchestrated by individuals within the church or by powerful laypeople who could use their position to create convincing backstories and suppress inconvenient questions. For the small-time operator, the risks were immediate and often catastrophic, and let's revisit the sheer, staggering economy built around faith. Pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual journey. It was the lifeblood of countless towns and regions. Shrines with famous relics were magnets for wealth. Pilgrims needed food, lodging, services, souvenirs, even back then. Roads needed maintenance, bridges needed repair, local markets exploded when pilgrims arrived. Churches themselves acquired vast tracts of land and wealth through offerings and the prestige their relics brought. A fake relic wasn't just a theological problem, it was an economic threat. It diverted potential pilgrims and their money away from legitimate sites. It could flood the market, devaluing genuine relics and the immense investments made in them. Imagine a town whose prosperity relied entirely on its claimed bone of St. Cuthbert. If suddenly dozens of genuine St. Cuthbert bones started appearing elsewhere, their unique selling proposition was ruined. The church wasn't just protecting sacred integrity, it was protecting a massive, interwoven economic system. And anyone seen as undermining that system, especially with deliberate falsehoods, was seen as a fundamental threat to the prosperity and stability of their community, adding yet another layer of danger to your precarious trade. This wasn't just about belief, it was about pounds, shillings, and pence, about property, and about power. That chilling possibility of being abandoned by the very spiritual authority you sought to exploit was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of your dealings. You learned to read faces, to spot the difference between fervent belief and cynical calculation in your potential buyers. You learned to listen for rumors, to know which abbots were stricter than others, which towns had a reputation for harsh justice, and which traveling preachers might be sniffing out fakery. Every whispered question about provenance, every skeptical glance at your carefully crafted holy object, sent a tiny jolt of fear through you. You were a predator in a market of piety, but you were also prey, constantly aware of the larger forces that could crush you. Beyond the formal laws and the church's stern pronouncements, there was another layer of belief, one deeply rooted in the soil and the seasons. Folk magic and superstition. While the church might condemn these practices as pagan remnants or outright heresy, they were woven into the daily lives of the people you sought to defraud. Many believed in curses, in the power of relics, real or imagined, to bring good or bad fortune through means that weren't always strictly aligned with official theology. They might perform small personal rituals with their purchased relic, seeking specific outcomes. A good harvest, the return of a lost lover, protection from the evil eye. And if their prayers went unanswered, if their relic failed to perform its promised miracle, they might not just lose faith in the object. They might suspect they'd been cursed by a deceiver. And the wrath of someone who believes you have not only stolen their money, but also potentially endangered their soul or invited misfortune through false sanctity, could be far more unpredictable and terrifying than any official punishment. There were also strange beliefs about the relics themselves. Some people claimed that genuine relics possessed a palpable heat, a faint glow, or even emitted a sweet scent, like violets or myrrh. Others looked for signs of incorruptibility, a body part that didn't decay as expected. While the church often focused on documentation and miracles, the common folk had their own sensory tests, born of a mix of genuine awe and old superstitions. You might hear tales of fake relics weeping blood, not as a sign of sanctity, but as a sign of divine displeasure at the deception. Or stories of a false bone that, when held during a storm, attracted lightning instead of warding it off. These weren't official doctrines, but they were deeply held beliefs that could turn a suspicious buyer into a furious mob in an instant. You had to be careful not just about official scrutiny, but about the unpredictable, often irrational, reactions of people whose deepest hopes and fears you were playing with. You saw a flicker in his eye that wasn't piety. It was suspicion. The moment hung in the air, thick and heavy, the scent of incense suddenly replaced by the metallic tang of fear in your own mouth. You had shown him the supposed splinter from the true cross, a piece of carefully shaped oak you'd acquired from a carpenter's scrap pile, and he was looking at it too closely, not with reverence, but with a calculating gaze. He asked a question about its provenance that was too specific, too informed. Did it come from the batch brought back by Emperor Heraclius? You stammered a vague affirmative, trying to sound knowledgeable, but the conviction wasn't there. You could almost hear the gears turning in his head, weighing your hesitant answer against the certainty of his doubt. This was it. The careful dance, the fabricated history, the hushed reverence, it was all about to crumble. You had to decide instantly, bluff harder, or cut your losses and disappear into the crowd before his suspicion turned into an accusation, before the quiet transaction became a very public, very dangerous scene. Navigating this world required more than just cunning. It required a deep, intuitive understanding of human nature, of belief, and of fear. You weren't just selling objects. You were selling hope, access to the divine, a tangible connection to a world beyond their difficult daily lives. And when you trade in something that precious and intangible, the backlash when the illusion shatters is rarely contained or rational. It's a bit like navigating the early days of the internet, perhaps, where distinguishing genuine information from elaborate scams required a whole new kind of literacy, and falling for a phishing scheme could have devastating real-world consequences. Only in your world, the phishing scheme involved God and the saints, and the consequences could be measured not just in lost coin, but in spiritual ruin, public shame, and a very real physical end. This was the tightrope you walked, every single day, selling salvation while risking damnation, one carefully crafted lie at a time. That flicker of suspicion, the question that cut too deep, the sudden shift in the air, it sends a cold dread through you that has nothing to do with the weather outside the damp stone walls. You manage to extract yourself from the situation, perhaps by feigning a sudden illness, or claiming you left the most crucial authentication document back at your lodgings, which, of course, don't exist. You disappear into the maze of alleys, your heart pounding not just from exertion, but from the sheer terror of the near miss. You walk faster, the worn leather of your shoes slapping against the mud and cobblestones, every shadow seeming to hide watchful eyes, every distant shout sounding like a pursuit. The smells of the city, the bakery's faint sweet yeast, the tannery's acrid stench, the ever-present undertone of sewage, suddenly feel less like the texture of life and more like the elements of a trap. But sometimes you aren't so lucky. Sometimes the quiet conversation ends abruptly. A heavy hand claps down on your shoulder. You hear the clank of armor or the rustle of heavy robes, and you know your careful performance has reached its final, unplanned scene. There's no shouting, often just a few grim words, and you are escorted away, the world tilting on its axis. The bustling marketplace, the familiar shops, the faces of ordinary people going about their day, they blur as you are led past them, some pointing, some turning away, a few whispering behind their hands. The shame washes over you, hot and sharp, quickly followed by the cold certainty of what is to come. You might be taken to the local jail, a place usually reserved for common criminals, thieves, brawlers, debtors. The air here is thick with the smell of damp straw, unwashed bodies, and human waste. It's cold and dark, the only light filtering through a narrow, barred window high up on the wall. The sounds are different too. The scraping of rats in the walls, the groans or curses of other inmates, the heavy tread of the guards outside your cell door. Your initial fear gives way to a grim understanding of your predicament. This isn't just a temporary inconvenience. This is the beginning of a process, one you likely won't walk away from easily, if at all. You are held here while your case is investigated, while the local authorities, or more likely, the church officials decide how to proceed with you. Every day that passes stretches into an eternity, filled with anxious thoughts about the accusations against you, the evidence they might gather, the fake relic itself, of course, but perhaps also witnesses, or even other people you've defrauded. The treatment in jail is basic and brutal. Food is scarce and unappetizing, perhaps thin gruel, hard bread, stale water. Hygiene is non-existent. Disease is a constant threat. You are at the mercy of the guards, some indifferent, others perhaps openly hostile, viewing you with contempt as someone who dared to mock the sacred. There's no comfort here, no solace, only the gnawing fear and the physical discomfort of your surroundings. You try to remember every detail of your transactions, every lie you told, trying to anticipate how they might build a case against you. Were your documents too obviously fake? Did you accidentally claim a relic had performed a miracle on a date that contradicted known history? Did you misidentify a saint's birthplace? Every potential error looms large in your mind now, amplified by the isolation and the knowledge that powerful forces are scrutinizing your every past action. Even in this grim setting, you might encounter fellow prisoners who committed lesser offenses. A poacher, a man who couldn't pay his debts, a woman accused of quarreling too loudly. But you quickly realize your crime is viewed differently. Their offenses are against man. Yours, in the eyes of your captors, is against God himself, or at least, against the earthly representatives of God. This elevates your crime to a different level, one that carries a far heavier spiritual weight, and consequently, a far more severe potential earthly punishment. You listen to their stories, their fears, their small hopes of release, and the vast, terrifying gulf between their mundane troubles and the cosmic implications of your own deceit becomes starkly clear. You didn't just steal coin, you meddled with the very fabric of faith, and the system was designed to make you pay for that transgression with every fiber of your being, both physical and spiritual. Okay, the grim comfort of the jail, if you can call it that, doesn't last. One morning, the heavy door creaks open, and you are not led out into the familiar stench of the courtyard, but into a different kind of space entirely. It's a transition from the purely physical discomfort of the secular prison to the more refined, yet far more existentially terrifying, pressure of the church's scrutiny. You are taken from the raw stone and damp straw to a room within a monastery or an ecclesiastical building, perhaps a chapter house or a bishop's private chambers. The air here is cleaner, cool and silent, carrying the faint scent of old parchment and beeswax candles. But the silence is heavy, oppressive. The stone walls are adorned not with graffiti or grime, but with frescoes depicting scenes of judgment, of saints in glory, and sinners in torment seated before you are figures draped in the heavy, formal robes of the clergy. Their faces are serious, their eyes steady and penetrating. This is not a king's judge looking for a breach of the peace or a lord's bailiff concerned with stolen property. These men are representatives of God on earth, and they are looking not just at your actions, but into your soul. The accusations aren't read from a civil statute book. They are presented as grave sins, sacrilege, fraud against the faithful, blasphemy, and potentially the most terrifying charge of all, heresy. You are not just accused of taking money under false pretenses. You are accused of tampering with the divine, of leading pious souls astray, of mocking the very foundations of their hope and salvation. The weight of this spiritual indictment feels heavier than any physical chain. The evidence against you is laid out with chilling precision. The fake relic itself is produced, perhaps your carefully shaped piece of bone, now looking pitifully mundane in the light of this solemn room, or the scrap of fabric, its fabricated history evaporating in the silence. Your crudely forged documents, once seeming so convincing in the dim light of a private sale, are now clearly just pieces of aged parchment with clumsy writing and ridiculous seals. The buyer, or perhaps a witness who overheard you making your claims, might be brought in to testify, their words painting you as a wolf in sheep's clothing, preying on their devotion. Every boast you made, every lie you told, is now laid bare, stripped of its persuasive context, and exposed as a deliberate deception against the sacred. The interrogation that follows is relentless, but its goal is different from a secular cross-examination. They are not just trying to establish facts. They are trying to break your will and force a confession, not just of the crime, but of the underlying sin and repentance. They speak calmly, but their words are edged with the terrifying possibility of eternal damnation. They remind you of the fires of hell, of the suffering of the damned, painting vivid, visceral pictures of what awaits an unrepentant soul who has defrauded God's people. They tell you that confessing is the first step towards absolution, the only path to potentially saving your soul from eternal torment. The psychological pressure is immense. Isolated, weary, facing men who believe utterly in their power to influence your eternal fate, you feel your resolve beginning to crumble. The comfort of denying your actions seems a small thing compared to the potential consequences they lay out before you with such absolute certainty. And then, they might introduce something even stranger, the informal, often weird, tests that medieval folk sometimes applied to relics, beliefs woven into the fabric of popular piety that even some clergy might entertain. They might speak of tales where genuine relics were said to be unnaturally light, almost floating, or conversely, possess a strange, compelling heaviness. You watch helpless as they perhaps place your supposed holy bone on a scale, or drop a fragment into a bowl of water, their expressions grimly assessing the result, interpreting every failure to perform a supposed miracle as further proof of your fraudulent, perhaps even impious nature. You hadn't just sold a fake object for coin. You had sold a counterfeit key to paradise, trading on the deepest human need for salvation. And in doing so, you realized You had condemned yourself in the eyes of those who held the power to damn you both now and forever. The air feels thinner, colder. Every denial, every attempt to explain away the evidence, feels weak and pathetic against the absolute conviction of the robed figures before you. Your crime wasn't just against secular law or economic order. It was against the spiritual order of the universe as they understood it. And the medieval church was terrifyingly equipped to make you understand the gravity of that offense, not just with earthly punishments, but with the chilling prospect of losing everything that mattered in the next life too. The pressure breaks you, whether through exhaustion, fear, or the sheer, overwhelming weight of the spiritual consequences they lay bare. You confess. You admit to the lies, the fabricated histories, the cheap materials you passed off as sacred treasures. The relief is minimal, a tiny pinprick against the vast, dark canvas of your predicament. Your confession might earn you a slightly less brutal earthly fate, but the stain on your soul, in their eyes, is deep. You have sinned not just against man, but against God, against the entire celestial hierarchy, and the Church's judgment, though it might spare your body the worst, cannot fully cleanse that. Your fate from this point depends on a complex web of factors. The whim of the bishop, the perceived scale of your fraud, whether you named others truthfully or not, and whether you can convince them, truly convince them, of your sincere repentance. For some caught in this predicament, the punishment was a life sentence of public penance, wearing those shameful symbols, forever marked as a deceiver, living on the fringes of a society that recoiled from you. You would spend your days begging for alms, performing prescribed prayers and acts of humility, a living, breathing cautionary tale for anyone tempted to follow your path. Your face, once perhaps masked by feigned piety, is now a public billboard advertising the dangers of spiritual fraud. For others, the judgment was harsher still. The public flogging or the time in the stocks might still be on the cards, a painful and humiliating prelude to further punishment. Banishment could be the sentence, leaving you a rootless wanderer, unable to settle, forever on the run from your past and the potential reach of the Church's long arm. You'd navigate a world where every town gate felt like a barrier, every stranger's gaze a potential threat, carrying not just your meager possessions, but the invisible, heavy burden of your excommunication or public shaming. And for the truly unlucky, or those whose fraud was deemed particularly heinous, scandalous, or tinged with heresy, the handover to the secular authorities was the final, chilling step. You would be led out of the quiet, stone halls of the Church's domain and back into the raw, public glare of civil justice. The charges might shift, slightly now focusing on the temporal crime of fraud and theft, but underscored by the Church's damning spiritual judgment. And the punishment for such offenses, particularly when the Church had essentially washed its hands of you, was often the ultimate deterrent of the age, execution. You might face the hangman's noose, a swift, public end. Or in the most severe cases, deemed a threat not just to faith, but to the purity of the Christian community, the terrifying prospect of the stake. Fire, the medieval mind believed, cleansed and destroyed, preventing the spread of spiritual corruption. Your life built on counterfeit holiness would end in a very real, very public conflagration, your body consumed, your soul, in the eyes of the onlookers, likely condemned. A final, brutal irony for someone who traded in the currency of salvation. Imagine the scene. The town square, the erected stake, the bundles of wood piled high. The smell of the kindling, the murmuring crowd, the grim-faced officials. Your final thoughts might not even be of the coin you gained, but of the hope you exploited, the faith you mocked. You gambled with something intangible and sacred, and the house, in this case, owned the very keys to paradise and the fires of hell. It's a stark reminder that in a world defined by unwavering belief, the consequences of playing fast and loose with the sacred were absolute, final, and designed to terrify anyone else who might consider that a bit of old bone and a good story were worth risking everything for. It makes you think, doesn't it, about the things we place our faith in today, the objects or ideas we imbue with power, and the often hidden, sometimes devastating, costs of deception, whether spiritual, financial, or personal. And that brings our journey to a gentle close. Thank you for drifting through this story with me tonight. I hope this quiet wander through a dangerous corner of medieval life helped you unwind, or at least gave you something a little different to ponder as you drift off. If you enjoyed the experience, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more sleepy, strange corners of history. It's the best way to let me know you enjoy these historical lullabies. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments if you feel like sharing. But for now, rest well. Let the sounds of this world fade and settle into the quiet of your own time and place. I'll see you in the next one. Sweet dreams.